What was meant to be a light-hearted television interview turned into one of the most intense and thought-provoking exchanges ever broadcast. When former President Barack Obama sat down with Jimmy Kimmel, no one expected the conversation to veer off script and ignite a firestorm of uncomfortable truths, sharp comebacks, and public reckoning. Viewers who tuned in for laughs got a lesson instead, one that left the audience in stunned silence. Make sure to like and subscribe for more stories that keep you on the edge of your seat. The set of Jimmy Kimmel Live buzzed with anticipation. The audience clapped with electric energy as Barack Obama walked on stage, his familiar composure intact, his smile measured. It was supposed to be just another night in Hollywood, just another celebrity interview. But as soon as Obama took his seat, something in the air shifted. There was a tension not even the warm lights or scripted jokes could soften. Why was the atmosphere so charged? Was there an unspoken challenge in Kimmel's opening remarks? Had the former president come prepared for more than laughs? Kimmel began with his usual charm, lobbing soft questions with a grin. The audience laughed, cheered, played along, but then, with the tone of someone who thought he had nothing to lose, Kimmel made a pivot. He leaned forward slightly, as if testing the waters of a deeper conversation, and posed a question that caught everyone off guard. "Mr. President, do you ever think maybe your message of hope, well, maybe it didn't quite pan out?" The laughter died instantly. Obama blinked, then looked at Kimmel with a calm that felt colder than silence. "You want to talk about hope?" he replied slowly. "Let's talk about responsibility first. Why did a joke turn into a confrontation? Why did Kimmel, usually quick with self-deprecation, double down?" "I mean," Kimmel said, his smile thinning, "you talked about unity, but we got division. You talked about progress, but it feels like we're spinning our wheels. People are angry, disappointed. Doesn't that reflect on you?" The audience shifted uncomfortably. It was no longer entertainment. This was something raw, something real. And Obama, far from shrinking from the moment, leaned in. His voice dropped just enough to draw people closer. "If you think one person, any person, could undo decades of systems built to protect the few at the expense of the many, then the problem is not who failed," Obama said. "The problem is what we're refusing to face." A few audience members clapped, but many were silent, unsure if they were watching a political takedown or an unmasking of television itself. Kimmel, sensing he had pushed too far, tried to steer the conversation back to lighter ground. But Obama did not follow. He continued, "You know, it's easy to sit behind a desk and throw stones at what didn't get done. But ask yourself, what did you do with the voice you had? Did you challenge lies, or did you turn them into punchlines?" Was that a shot at Kimmel's monologues? Was Obama calling out the media itself? Kimmel tried to laugh it off, but it didn't land. "I guess we all have our jobs," he said. Obama nodded, "and history will judge how we used them." That single line settled like smoke in the studio. Nobody clapped, not because they were angry, but because they didn't know how to respond. The lines between guest and host, entertainer and leader had blurred. For the first time on that stage, Jimmy Kimmel looked like the one being interviewed. How far would this go? Would Kimmel fight back? Would Obama pull punches, or was he only just beginning? Kimmel took a brief sip of water, as if stalling for time, trying to reset the moment. But the control he usually commanded over his stage was slipping, replaced by something heavier, something unspoken. He chuckled nervously, glancing at the camera, perhaps searching for a lifeline. But the audience wasn't laughing anymore. They were watching, not as spectators to a show, but as witnesses to something unscripted and painfully real. He tried again. "Look, I get it. You had a tough job. But isn't it fair to say a lot of folks feel like they were promised change and handed disappointment?" Obama didn't flinch. "Disappointment," he echoed. "Let me tell you something about that. Real change doesn't fit inside a commercial break. It doesn't bend to approval ratings or late-night punchlines. Real change costs people something. The room grew still. Kimmel blinked, visibly surprised by the weight of the response. I came into office with a financial collapse at my feet, 2 wars burning, and a healthcare system in tatters. And yet we moved the dial forward, inch by inch, not mile by mile. But change isn't just about policies. It's about shifting the consciousness of a country addicted to shortcuts. The audience sat in reverent quiet, absorbing every word. It was no longer an interview. It was a reckoning. Kimmel leaned back, clearly wrestling with how far to go. But then, perhaps out of pride, or maybe out of instinct, he pressed forward. "But what about now?" he asked. "Look at the state of the country. You say you moved the dial, but what if it was all temporary? Maybe the people lost faith not in hope, but in whether it was ever real." Obama's expression hardened. He clasped his hands together, his voice lowering. "Hope is not a promise. It's a burden. It's something you carry even when the evidence tells you to put it down. And that's where the media comes in. Because the louder the noise, the harder it becomes for truth to breathe." There it was. Not just a defense, but an indictment. And it wasn't aimed at the government. It was aimed at the echo chamber Kimmel was a part of. "You can keep poking at the symptoms," Obama continued, "but until you start questioning the machinery that profits off division, you're not challenging the system. You're feeding it." Kimmel opened his mouth, then closed it. No witty comeback, no smug grin. Just the unmistakable silence of a man cornered by truth. He tried to pivot again, asking a question about Obama's recent speeches and foundation work. But even that fell flat. The audience was no longer interested in canned responses. They wanted more of what they just saw. Raw, unscripted, uncomfortable honesty. Then Obama added something that hit even harder. "You know what scares people the most? Not that change is slow, but that it asks them to change too." The statement echoed in the air like a challenge. And it landed squarely on Kimmel's shoulders. In a desperate attempt to recover the vibe, Kimmel reached for humor. "Well, this has been a light-hearted chat," he said, smiling uneasily. "I think I'm sweating through my shirt." A few in the audience laughed, mostly out of tension. But the smile on Obama's face wasn't one of pity or camaraderie. It was one of certainty. He knew he had shifted the terrain, and he was not done. As the camera panned to a wide shot, the crew subtly signaled a commercial break. But even as the lights dimmed and music swelled, everyone knew that whatever came next would not be business as usual. Would Kimmel try to reclaim the stage when they returned? Or had he just been publicly outmatched in his own house? The cameras returned from commercial to a tighter shot. Kimmel's posture had changed. His usual relaxed lean was now a more rigid stance, elbows on the desk, hands clasped. The smile was there, but it looked worn in now, like a costume he was forcing to stay on. Obama, by contrast, sat calmly, unmoved, unhurried, and completely in control of the room. "So," Kimmel began, his voice a little slower, "I have to ask, when you watch what is happening today, do you ever think that maybe the system is too broken to fix?" It was a fair question, the kind he could rely on to shift the tone to something less pointed. But Obama wasn't in the mood for abstraction. "I think the system reflects the people who participate in it," he replied. "So the question isn't whether it's broken. The question is, how long are we going to keep pretending we're not the ones holding the wrench?" There it was again. The flip. Obama was turning Kimmel's questions inside out and handing them back with more weight than before. Kimmel tried to respond, but Obama leaned forward, cutting him off. Not rudely, but with authority. "Jimmy, you have a voice. Millions listens. 2. You crack jokes about politicians and pundits, but rarely do you take aim at the structure that lets them thrive. You make cynicism entertaining, and that's dangerous. Because when people laugh instead of act, the powerful sleep easier. The Audience murmured. That line wasn't just an observation. It was a mirror. One pointed directly at the culture Kimmel represented. Now visibly rattled, Kimmel attempted a pivot to lighten the mood again. "Okay," he said, chuckling nervously. "I think I need my therapist on speed dial right about now." But Obama did not laugh. He didn't offer a lifeline. Instead, he doubled down. "You joke," he said, "but people out there are angry, not because they're hopeless, but because they were taught that change was someone else's job. You have the power to disrupt that. But instead, you've made it a punchline." The crowd went quiet again, not out of discomfort, but out of recognition. This was a rare kind of television, not entertainment, not propaganda. Something closer to truth and far more rare. Kimmel looked down at his notes but didn't speak. Then, slowly, he looked up. "Do you think I'm part of the problem?" he asked. It was less a challenge and more a confession. Obama didn't let him off easy. "I think you're part of the culture, and the culture has learned how to laugh its way out of responsibility. If you want to change that, it starts by asking better questions, not just of your guests but of yourself." The audience responded with a soft, stunned applause. It wasn't for performance. It was for honesty. The kind of honesty that leaves bruises but also cracks. Open the door to something deeper. At this point, the interview had fully unraveled from its original intent. There were no prepared bits, no cheeky anecdotes or sound bites. Just two men, one trying to keep the show on its rails, the other dismantling the tracks one truth at a time. Then Kimmel said something surprising, something rare. "You know," he muttered, adjusting his tie, "maybe we should have had this conversation a long time ago." Obama nodded once. "Maybe you should have started it." There was no malice in his tone, no personal jab. Just a clean, honest challenge. The kind that leaves a scar, but also plants a seed. A silence settled over the room again. But this time it wasn't awkward. It was reverent. Something had just shifted, not just in the interview, but in the audience, and Kimmel knew it. He swallowed, glanced at his producer behind the camera, then turned back to Obama. "Well," he said, voice quieter now, "you're not wrong." Obama smiled gently. "That's a start." Fade to another commercial, but now the energy had changed. The viewers at home, just like those in the studio, weren't waiting for a joke. They were waiting to see if Kimmel would keep pretending, or if he would finally lean into the truth pressing in around him. What happens when a talk show host finally listens? When the lights returned for the final segment, the studio was no longer a playground for late-night laughter. Something had shifted, subtle but seismic. Kimmel's desk, once a symbol of command, now looked like a barrier. Obama, relaxed and composed, remained seated like a professor who had already delivered the lesson and was waiting for the class to process it. Kimmel tapped his fingers on the desk, not out of boredom but contemplation. For a long moment, he didn't speak. And when he finally did, it was without his usual timing or flair. "I do this show 5 nights a week. I joke about a lot of things," he said. "And maybe sometimes I forget people are actually listening." Obama leaned in slightly, his expression softening. "It is not about forgetting, Jimmy. It's about deciding whether what you say helps people move or helps them sit still." The words weren't cruel. They were calibrated, precise. Obama wasn't out for humiliation. He was after accountability. And the audience, now leaning in with quiet intensity, sensed it too. Kimmel looked out at the crowd, eyes scanning the faces. Something inside him was turning over, reshaping. Then he pivoted. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Not as a comedian, as someone who's confused. Do you think people really believe change is possible anymore?" Obama's reply came slowly, but with unmistakable clarity. "I think people believe it when they see someone willing to risk something. For it. Silence again. But this time it didn't feel empty. It felt necessary. Kimmel looked down, collected himself, then tried to wrest back a sense of control. "Okay, well, for the record," he said with a half-smile, "you've definitely ruined my plans for an easy Thursday night." A few people laughed, but not the usual belly laughs. These were more like exhalations, release from tension, from expectation, from scripted comfort. Obama chuckled lightly. That's what conversations are supposed to do sometimes. Then he pivoted to something deeper. You know, one of the things that bothered me most when I was in office wasn't the opposition or the media. It was the resignation. The sense that people had accepted dysfunction like it was gravity. But gravity does not hold us back. Apathy does. That statement struck like thunder. Kimmel blinked, thrown again by the sheer weight of it. "You really think apathy is our biggest threat?" Obama nodded. Apathy, distraction, the idea that politics is just a spectacle, not a mechanism for justice. That is what eats away at democracies. Not scandal, not failure, but silence. The tension was still thick, but now it carried with it an undercurrent of urgency. Kimmel turned to the camera. "So, what do we do then? What the hell are we supposed to do?" Obama's response was instant, as though he'd been waiting for that question all night. "You start by refusing to be entertained by your own powerlessness." The room fell into awe again. No applause, just stillness. It was the kind of line that would echo in the minds of everyone who heard it. An indictment and an invitation wrapped into one. At this point, the interview was no longer a battle of ideologies or egos. It had transformed into a reckoning. One man peeling back the sheen of celebrity, exposing the hollowness behind the jokes, and daring the host, and by extension, the country, to face itself honestly. Then Kimmel did something he had never done before. He stood up. Without a word, he stepped from behind his desk and walked to the center of the stage, now standing next to Obama shoulder to shoulder. The symbolism was obvious and necessary. "I don't know what kind of show I am supposed to run tomorrow," he said, "but I know it cannot be the same as yesterday's." The audience erupted, not in laughter, but in applause. A standing ovation, not for performance, but for courage, for the audacity of humility. Obama smiled. "That," he said, "is how change begins." And just like that, the dynamic flipped. What began as a collision between a former president and a late-night comedian had evolved into something neither of them planned for. A moment of shared transformation. A rare, unguarded sliver of truth on a stage built for performance. Cameras captured it all. The vulnerability, the awakening, the possibility. And as the lights began to dim, the viewers at home were left with a final image. Two men no longer debating, but standing in acknowledgement of something larger than both of them, something real. Outside the studio, the world kept moving. Cars honked, phones buzzed, headlines rotated like they always did. But for those who had witnessed what happened on Jimmy Kimmel's stage that night, something had shifted permanently. The footage exploded online. Within hours, clips of Obama's most cutting remarks were circulating across every platform imaginable. Hashtags soared, but unlike the usual whirlwind of outrage or parody, this time the reaction was different. This was not a meme. It was a moment. On social media, people from across the political spectrum, young activists, former skeptics, even longtime critics of both Kimmel and Obama, were saying the same thing. This didn't feel like TV. This felt real. The unfiltered exchange, the rejection of pretense, had pierced through the fog of entertainment and left something behind that no tweet could fully capture. Clarity. Back in the green room, Kimmel sat in silence, his phone untouched. For once, he was not checking how many impressions the segment had generated or whether a monologue joke had landed. He stared at the wall, absorbing everything. And then, almost hesitantly, he turned to one of his producers and said, "I don't think I've ever actually listened before." Meanwhile, Obama had already left the building. No entourage, no extra fanfare. Just a quiet exit through a side door. That was always his way. Light the match, then walk away before the crowd gathered around the flame. But the fire kept burning. News outlets scrambled to respond. Some tried to spin it as a publicity stunt. Others, more honest, admitted they had never seen Kimmel so exposed, so human. A few anchors even admitted they had begun rethinking how they approached their own coverage. Less like commentators, more like citizens. Because that was the ripple effect. Obama had not just schooled Kimmel. He had challenged the entire machinery of distraction. Back on set the following night, Kimmel stood in front of a live audience again. But there was no monologue, no punchline. Just a single camera, a quiet stage, and one man stepping into discomfort. He addressed the crowd without cue cards. "I want to thank everyone who watched last night's show. I've been doing this for over 20 years. I have interviewed presidents, actors, athletes, and once, a guy who claimed to talk to squirrels. But nothing, and I mean nothing, has ever changed me like that conversation." The audience remained silent, sensing that this was not another performance. He continued, "Barack Obama didn't just sit here and lecture me. He forced me to see the space between my words and my actions. That space is where our country is choking." Then came the part that stunned everyone. "I am going to use this show differently now. Not every night. Not all the time. But from this moment forward, we're going to make space for real conversations. And if that costs me ratings, then good." The applause came. Not explosive, but deeply felt. The audience rose again, not because they had been entertained, but because they had been awakened. And for once, applause did not feel like an ending. It felt like permission. Permission for discomfort, for honesty, for trying, even clumsily, to say something true in a time when so much of what we hear is meant to distract, not enlighten. Obama, watching quietly from home, offered no tweet, no statement. He didn't need to. His message had landed. And not just in the mind of one comedian, but in the hearts of millions who were tired of noise and ready for substance. By the following week, other shows began changing. More space for dialogue. Fewer gimmicks. More interruptions replaced with deeper questions. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a start. And that is all Obama ever asked for. Because in the end, this was never about embarrassing Jimmy Kimmel or scoring viral points. It was about something far more dangerous to cynicism: hope. Hope that television, like politics, can still be used to elevate rather than numb. Hope that people, when spoken to directly and truthfully, will listen. And most of all, hope that even the loudest voices can sometimes pause long enough to hear something they never expected. A hard truth delivered with calm precision. And for once, in the bright, polished world of late-night television, the most powerful thing said was not a joke, but a challenge. A challenge not just to Jimmy Kimmel, but to us all.